prosody. There's a specific kind of dread that settles in when someone starts sensing that a person they know, prosody, someone whose patterns they've spent years learning to read, has shifted into something noticeably darker than anything they've witnessed before. Not just difficult, not just manipulative in the familiar, varying ways that have become almost routine. Something else, prosody. Something that feels less like the person you've been dealing with and more like a version of them you don't have a map for yet, prosody. And that absence of a map is exactly what makes this particular moment so unsettling. I want to be honest with you as we begin, prosody, because this topic deserves real care rather than sensationalized fear. Prosody. Not every difficult moment in a narcissistic dynamic represents someone entering a genuinely dangerous phase. Most conflict, prosody, even painful conflict, stays within a recognizable range, the range we've traced throughout other explorations in this series, prosody. But there is a real, identifiable shift that some narcissists undergo, typically triggered by a significant loss of control, prosody, and this shift produces behavior that genuinely differs in both intensity and unpredictability from their ordinary patterns. Today we're examining 3 specific signs of this deeper shift, so you can recognize it clearly if you're witnessing it, prosody. And so you can trust your own instincts if some part of you has already been sensing that something has changed in a way that feels different from anything you've navigated with this person before. Before we go further, an important note, prosody. The same one worth repeating whenever this topic touches on genuine safety rather than purely psychological pattern, prosody. If what you're recognizing includes fear for your physical safety, threats, prosody, or a sense that circumstances are becoming genuinely unpredictable and dangerous, prosody, please understand that this moves beyond what psychological understanding alone can safely address. And reaching out to a domestic violence hotline or local support service isn't an overreaction, prosody. It's exactly the kind of resource these situations exist for. We'll return to this at the end, but I want it said clearly now too, prosody, because if any part of this resonates urgently while you're watching, prosody, you shouldn't have to wait until the end of the video to be reminded that help exists. Let's talk about what actually triggers this darker phase, prosody. Because understanding the trigger explains why the resulting behavior looks so different from the patterns we've traced throughout the rest of this series, prosody. Everything we've discussed in previous explorations, the testing behavior, the narrative construction, the escalated pursuit or devaluation, prosody, tends to unfold within a framework where the narcissist still believes, at some level, that control remains available to them, prosody, that the old tools might still work if applied with enough persistence or enough intensity, prosody. This darkest phase tends to emerge specifically when that belief collapses entirely, when it becomes undeniable, prosody. Even to someone whose entire psychology is built around avoiding exactly this realization, that control is genuinely, permanently gone. This collapse matters enormously, prosody. Because remember everything we've traced throughout this series about what a narcissist's underlying psychology is actually protecting against, prosody. A fragile sense of self that cannot easily tolerate the direct experience of powerlessness or insignificance, prosody. As long as some pathway back to control still seems available, even a slim one, the psychology has somewhere to direct its energy, some strategy left to attempt. When every pathway genuinely closes, when pursuit has failed, prosody, when devaluation hasn't produced the desired reaction, when isolation and narrative control haven't restored the old dynamic, prosody, what remains is something considerably rawer and less strategic, because the strategies have run out, prosody. This is worth understanding as the actual mechanism behind this darkest phase. It isn't a deeper, more sophisticated form of manipulation, prosody. It's closer to the collapse of manipulation altogether, prosody. The exposure of the raw panic that all the earlier strategies existed specifically to manage and conceal. Let's talk about the first sign, prosody, because it's often the earliest indicator that this deeper shift is underway. A sudden, marked increase in unpredictability, prosody. Specifically, a loss of the internal consistency that, however troubling, had at least made this person's behavior somewhat trackable before, prosody. This is worth explaining precisely, because unpredictability itself isn't new in these dynamics, prosody. We've discussed throughout this series how central inconsistency and unpredictability are to how these patterns typically function, prosody. What's different here is the degree and the texture of that unpredictability, prosody. Ordinary narcissistic unpredictability tends to follow a discernible logic once you understand the underlying mechanism, prosody. Cruelty following disappointment, warmth following the threat of losing control, escalation following a boundary, prosody. This new unpredictability doesn't follow that logic nearly as reliably, prosody. Reactions become disproportionate in ways that don't map cleanly onto any identifiable trigger. Mood shifts happen more rapidly, more severely, prosody, and with less obvious connection to anything actually happening around them, prosody. This matters because it reflects something important about what's actually occurring internally during this darkest phase, prosody. The psychological structure that normally organizes and directs this behavior, however unhealthy that structure has always been, prosody, is genuinely destabilizing. The strategies aren't being deployed deliberately anymore, even in the semi-conscious way they often were before. What's surfacing instead is closer to raw reactivity, less filtered, less directed, prosody. Considerably harder to anticipate because it's no longer being organized around a specific goal the way earlier stage behavior generally was, prosody. If you've noticed, specifically, that behavior which used to feel at least somewhat predictable, however painful, prosody, has become genuinely erratic in ways that defy the patterns you'd learned to expect, prosody. This shift in the texture of unpredictability itself is worth taking seriously as information. Let's talk about the second sign, prosody. One that connects directly to something we discussed in the previous exploration about grief leakage, prosody, but represents a considerably more severe and concerning version of that same underlying process, prosody. A collapse of impulse control specifically around actions that carry real, serious consequences, prosody. Ones that a more strategic version of this person would have previously avoided out of self-interest alone, prosody. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from ordinary poor decision-making, prosody, because it reflects something important about what happens when the underlying psychological structure destabilizes severely enough, prosody. Even at their most manipulative, most narcissists retain some degree of strategic self-interest and awareness, even if distorted, prosody, of consequences that matter to their own image, their own resources, their own long-term stability, prosody. This awareness typically functions as a kind of brake, preventing certain behaviors specifically because the fallout would cost them too much. What's worth watching for in this darkest phase specifically is the erosion of exactly this brake, prosody. Actions that would have previously seemed too risky, too costly, too likely to produce serious consequences start happening anyway. Not because a careful calculation concluded the risk was worth taking, prosody, but because the capacity for that calculation itself has genuinely deteriorated. This might look like reckless financial decisions, sudden, prosody, dramatic professional missteps, escalating substance use, or behavior toward you or others that crosses lines this person had previously, prosody, consistently avoided, specifically because avoiding them had always served their own self-interest, prosody. When self-interest itself stops functioning as an effective brake, something genuinely significant has shifted, prosody. And it's worth taking this shift seriously rather than assuming, as you might have with earlier, more strategic behavior, prosody, that some underlying logic will eventually reveal itself and make sense of what you're witnessing. We'll cover the third and most important sign, prosody, along with what this entire shift actually means for your own safety and decision-making in the next part of this exploration, prosody, because it deserves the full space and careful attention this topic requires, prosody, rather than being rushed through here alongside everything else we've already covered. Part 2. Let's move into the third sign, prosody. Because it's arguably the most important one to recognize clearly, prosody, and it connects directly to everything we discussed about the collapse of strategic self-interest in Part 1, prosody. A shift from controlling you to needing you to suffer, specifically, visibly, and without any clear strategic purpose behind it, prosody. This distinction is worth explaining with real precision, prosody, because it represents the clearest boundary between the earlier stage patterns we've traced throughout this series and the genuinely darker phase this exploration is specifically about. Everything we've discussed in previous explorations, testing behavior, narrative construction, escalated pursuit, even devaluation, prosody, ultimately serves some kind of underlying goal, however distorted: restoring control, protecting self-image, maintaining access, prosody, preserving a favorable narrative. Even cruel behavior, in these earlier stages, tends to have some discernible function attached to it, prosody. This third sign looks different, because the cruelty stops being instrumental and starts becoming, in a sense, the entire point, prosody. Actions taken specifically to cause pain, without any accompanying goal of restoring the relationship, improving their own image, prosody, or achieving any practical outcome at all, purely for the sake of ensuring that suffering occurs and is witnessed, prosody. This is worth understanding as genuinely more concerning than anything we've traced in earlier explorations throughout this series, prosody, because it reflects something important about what's happening internally during this phase. When every strategic pathway has genuinely collapsed, prosody, when control can no longer be restored through any of the usual methods, prosody, causing visible pain sometimes becomes the last remaining way this destabilized psychology can generate any sense of impact or significance at all, prosody. It isn't about winning you back or protecting their image anymore, because those goals have already been abandoned as unreachable, prosody. It becomes about proving, to themselves as much as to you, that they still have the power to affect you, prosody, even if that power now expresses itself purely through harm rather than through any of the more complex, self-interested strategies we've discussed throughout the rest of this series. This is worth naming directly, prosody, because it has real implications for how seriously this particular sign should be taken, prosody. If you notice behavior that seems to have no goal beyond causing pain, actions that don't serve reconciliation, don't serve their public image, don't serve any recognizable self-interest at all, prosody, this represents a genuinely different category of concern than the manipulative, but ultimately self-interested behavior we've traced throughout most of this series, prosody. Self-interested behavior, however painful, tends to have limits, prosody, because self-interest itself imposes some boundary on how far someone is willing to go, prosody. Behavior that has abandoned self-interest in favor of pure, unstrategic harm doesn't have that same built-in limit, prosody. And this absence of a limiting factor is exactly what makes this third sign the most important one to recognize clearly and respond to seriously. Let's talk about what these three signs actually mean when they appear together, prosody, because understanding this convergence matters considerably more than recognizing any single sign in isolation. Marked unpredictability, prosody, a collapse of the self-interested brake on risky or harmful behavior, and a shift toward cruelty that no longer serves any strategic purpose. These three signs appearing together, prosody, indicate that the underlying psychological structure has genuinely destabilized in a way that goes beyond the patterns this entire series has otherwise focused on, prosody. This isn't simply someone being more manipulative or more difficult. It's someone whose usual, if unhealthy, prosody, organizing structure has broken down significantly enough that their behavior is no longer being filtered through the calculations, however distorted, that previously governed it. This is worth understanding as genuinely important information, prosody, because it changes what kind of response actually makes sense. Throughout most of this series, we've discussed psychological strategies, indifference, consistency, boundaries, detachment, as the tools that gradually, over time, Remove a narcissist's usual sources of power and control. Those strategies remain valuable in ordinary circumstances. Prosody. But when someone has moved into this darkest phase, when the three signs we've discussed are genuinely present together, the priority shifts. This isn't primarily a moment for psychological strategy anymore. It's a moment for safety planning. And it's worth understanding clearly why these two things require different approaches. Psychological strategies, the kind we've spent most of this series exploring, prosody, work by gradually withdrawing engagement and waiting for a destabilized system to either exhaust itself or reorganize around a new equilibrium. Prosody. This approach assumes a certain baseline of predictability. Prosody. That even manipulative behavior follows some discernible logic, that patience and consistency can eventually outlast. Prosody. When unpredictability has genuinely escalated, when self-interested limits have genuinely eroded. Prosody. And when cruelty has genuinely become unmoored from any strategic goal, this baseline assumption no longer holds reliably. Prosody. And waiting for the pattern to exhaust itself carries real risk that it wouldn't carry in earlier, more strategic stages of these dynamics. Prosody. This is exactly why the final part of this exploration needs to move away from psychological explanation and toward something more practical and more urgent. Prosody. What it actually means to take these three signs seriously. What specific, concrete steps make sense once you recognize this convergence clearly. Prosody. And why prioritizing your own safety in this specific moment matters more than any of the psychological understanding we've built throughout the rest of this series. However valuable that understanding remains in less severe circumstances. Prosody. Let's talk directly about what taking these three signs seriously actually looks like in practice. Prosody. Because understanding this darkest phase psychologically only matters if it translates into real, protective action. Prosody. If you're recognizing genuine convergence, marked unpredictability that no longer follows recognizable patterns. Prosody. A visible erosion of the self, interested limits that used to constrain even harmful behavior. Prosody. And cruelty that seems to serve no purpose beyond causing pain itself. The most important thing to understand is this. Prosody. The strategies we've discussed throughout most of this series, patient detachment, consistent boundaries, quiet indifference, prosody, remain valuable long-term tools, but they were designed for a psychology still operating within recognizable, if unhealthy, limits. Prosody. When those limits have genuinely eroded, safety has to become the immediate priority, ahead of psychological strategy, ahead of understanding. Prosody. Ahead of anything else this entire series has explored. Here's what this looks like concretely. Prosody. And it's worth naming these steps directly rather than leaving them abstract. First, reduce direct, unsupervised contact wherever possible. Particularly contact that happens in isolated settings without anyone else present or aware of where you are. Prosody. This isn't about permanently cutting off all communication, especially in circumstances involving shared responsibilities like children, where complete separation isn't immediately possible. Prosody. It's about minimizing situations where unpredictable behavior with no strategic limits could escalate without anyone else nearby to help, notice, prosody, or intervene. Second, document what you're observing, dates, specific incidents, anything that feels like part of this pattern. Not because documentation alone resolves anything, but because an accurate, prosody, contemporaneous record matters considerably more than memory alone. If you ever need to explain this pattern to a therapist, an attorney, law enforcement, or anyone else whose support you might eventually need. Third, and this is worth naming with real emphasis, tell people. Prosody. This darkest phase thrives specifically in isolation. Prosody. And remember everything we traced earlier in this series about how isolation itself functions as one of the earliest, prosody, most foundational patterns that makes everything else possible. If you've noticed your own circle narrowing over the course of this relationship, prosody, this is exactly the moment to deliberately, actively work against that narrowing, reaching back out to people who care about you, prosody, letting them know honestly what you're observing, even if it feels uncomfortable or embarrassing to admit how serious things have become. Prosody. People who know what's happening can offer perspective, practical support, and, if it ever becomes necessary, prosody, direct help in ways that isolation specifically prevents. Fourth, involve professional support specifically trained for this kind of situation. Prosody. A therapist experienced with coercive control and high conflict dynamics can help you think through your specific circumstances with expertise this video, however carefully constructed, simply cannot replace. And if what you're experiencing includes genuine fear for your physical safety, prosody. If any part of you is wondering whether things have become dangerous rather than simply painful, please reach out to a domestic violence hotline. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. And if you're elsewhere, prosody. A quick search will connect you with your country's equivalent resource, prosody. These organizations specialize specifically in safety planning for exactly this kind of escalation, prosody. And reaching out doesn't require certainty that you're in danger. If you're uncertain enough to be asking the question, that uncertainty itself is worth taking seriously. Prosody. Let's close this exploration with something important to understand about what recognizing this darkest phase actually means, prosody, and how it fits into everything else we've traced throughout this entire series. This isn't a contradiction of everything we've discussed about detachment, indifference, and quiet, patient release from these dynamics. It's an important addition to that understanding, a recognition that these psychological principles, while genuinely valuable in most circumstances, require careful, prosody, honest reassessment when the underlying psychology they're designed to navigate is genuinely destabilized beyond its usual limits. Wisdom, in these situations, isn't rigid adherence to a single approach regardless of circumstances, prosody. It's the willingness to recognize when circumstances have shifted seriously enough to require a different response, prosody. If you're watching this and recognizing your own situation in what we've described, please understand something important. Noticing this shift, taking it seriously, and prioritizing concrete safety over psychological strategy isn't giving up on everything else this series has explored, prosody. It's applying exactly the discernment this entire series has been building toward from its very first exploration, the capacity to read a pattern accurately, to trust what you're actually observing rather than dismissing it or explaining it away, prosody, and to respond appropriately to what the pattern genuinely requires, rather than defaulting to whatever approach felt right in earlier, prosody, less severe circumstances. You've spent, likely, considerable time learning to understand this psychology in detail, prosody, developing exactly the kind of discernment we've discussed throughout this entire series as one of the most valuable, prosody, hard-won capacities available to anyone who survives these dynamics. Trust that discernment now, prosody, specifically in recognizing when a situation has moved beyond what psychological understanding alone can safely address. Reaching for real, practical support, whether that's trusted people in your life, professional guidance, or dedicated safety resources, prosody isn't a failure of the understanding you've built. It's the most important, prosody, most protective application of everything that understanding was always meant to serve, not abstract insight for its own sake, but your genuine, prosody, concrete safety and well-being prioritized clearly and acted on decisively, exactly when it matters most.